Well, I figure it's about time that we start really diving into the latest Camera Raw that we have here inside of Photoshop CS3. And if you haven't followed the news, there's been an update to Camera Raw. It's Camera Raw 4.1. So you'll definitely want to update your Photoshop as well. You can go to adobe.com/Camera Raw and you can download the latest update there for free along with installation instructions. So that said, that's what I'm going to be looking at here. I called it Camera Raw 101 the first time I did this video for the NAP member website. And I could call this Camera Raw 4 101 or whatever. There's too many numbers in that, but it's basically kind of your introduction into Camera Raw, and I'm gonna do more videos on this. So I'm gonna work through the whole Camera Raw dialog. And this one here, we're just gonna cover some of the basics. So let's open Bridge. Inside Bridge, navigate to the folder that has your RAW files in it. You can see here I shoot with a Nikon, so mine say .nef. If you shoot with another brand camera, yours will probably say something different. But when you double click that RAW file in Bridge, it will automatically open it into the Camera Raw plugin. And that's important to know that Camera Raw is a plugin. All right, it's something that you do to your photos before you move them over into Photoshop. Okay, and think of it this way: it's processing your photos. Okay, I do my processing here, I get my color and my tone right, and then I move into Photoshop and I do my pixel level work, my retouching, my compositing, my text. All right, so just a quick overview of the dialog here. You've got your photo, which will always be in the center. You've got the toolbar, which is right at the top here, and we are going to cover all these things. Again, I just want to take a look at the basic panel, which is over here in this video, because honestly, that's where I spend 90% of my time is this basic panel, okay? And this is where you're probably going to find out you spend most of your time. And then, but over here, you've got all of your settings, and each one of these little icons that you see here is a tab. So whenever you hear me refer to tabs, this is what I'm referring to. So let's start off with the basic tab. And the way to work through this one is to think of it from the top down. And that's how I work through it. It's pretty much laid out in a good workflow order. So the first thing we want to do here is white balance. Let's get the overall white balance, the feeling, the mood, the color of our photo down first. There's a couple ways to do it. Up here inside the options bar, the toolbar here, you have the white balance tool. If, say, you shot using a gray card or some type of a white balance card, and somebody's holding that card or you have one positioned in the photo, you can just click on it. I don't have one here, but I'll just click on an area that's the neutral gray color, and you can see it changes the photo. All right, so that's one option. Another option is the drop-down list, which shows you settings that are very similar to what you'd see from your camera. All right, so you can come in here and experiment, and honestly, this is my favorite option right inside here. This is the one that I find I use the most, is this white balance list. And then you've got temperature and tint. And all these settings, the three ways you can move the temperature and tint sliders, by the way, you're not stuck with them the way they are. But all three of these settings are just the same way of doing the same thing, and that's setting the white balance, and they all just change your temperature and tint sliders. So whether or not I click on a setting here, it changes temperature and tint. Whether or not I click with the eyedropper, it changes temperature and tint, or whether or not I actually click on the sliders and I change them here. It's different ways of doing the same thing. I told you my favorite, which is this list here, unless I've shot with some type of a card, and then if I did, then I'll use the eyedropper to click on that gray point. Now moving on down the line, we get to our exposure or our tonal adjustments that you can call them, and this is where we start to attack exposure and shadows and highlights. First thing we have is exposure. The way this one works is a lot like the levels adjustment inside of Photoshop. If you look inside the levels adjustment, you'll see that there's a white slider on the right side. This exposure is a lot like that. It's going to focus on this part of your photo, and if you look at my histogram, see the histogram over here, you can see that I'm missing all this information. The histogram really could go all the way up to here. So I'll take my exposure slider and I'll drag it and watch the histogram. It's just like moving that white slider inside of levels, okay? And what you're doing here is you're actually saying, now this is my white point. Okay, this is where I want my white point of my photo to be. you've also got these little hints right below it. It's a gradient. And I know if I drag it to the right, white, drag it to the left, dark. So brighter, darker. Okay. Little keyboard shortcut for you here. If you hold down the Option key on the Mac, Alt on the PC, and you drag, you'll see here, see what happens? See how it starts to show me, it turns black, and whatever I see now means it's being clipped. It's a highlight clipping warning. All right, so it's a quick preview area for you to see where you're pushing all the detail toward white. All this is being pushed to white. You could also see your highlight clipping if you click on that little triangle right at the top here, or your shadow clipping if you click on that little triangle right at the top here, and it shows you. I don't really like them because I don't like to see these red and blue blotches over my photos. Now the next one here is recovery. So after I set my exposure, what you may notice, I'm going to turn this on just for a moment, is you may notice that you do tend to clip your highlights. Well, before the latest version of Camera Raw, before CS3, our only recourse here was to bring our exposure down and affect the entire photo. But now, with the recovery slider, watch this. I just drag it and I take all of that highlight clipping away. What I'm doing here is I'm recovering the detail in my highlights. That's what the recovery slider does. It's a highlight recovery tool. And look, it doesn't even touch the rest of the photo. It's just working on those extreme highlights. Okay? Whereas exposure, that touches the entire photo. Alright, so that's why I like the recovery slider here, because I can get in here and I can bring back detail without touching my exposure. Now we have fill light, which is like the opposite of recovery. Recovery was highlight recovery. Fill light is like shadow recovery. It's like shadow detail recovery. So you can see her hair, some of the shadows back here. As I bring up my fill light, I will start to bring out detail in some of those areas. Obviously you don't want to go this far, but you could if you wanted to. I bring it up a little bit, and I always follow it up with a blacks adjustment, because it might push some of my colors toward kind of a muddy gray color. Now, your blacks adjustment is just like that black point slider that we have inside of Photoshop. All right, so when you open up levels, you see your white point slider on the right, and then you see your black point slider on the left. Exposure was the white slider. Blacks is just like that black slider. All right, so this is where you're working on this part of the histogram here. Brightness and contrast, I don't use too much anymore. Contrast especially because I like to use the tone curve for that, and we're going to cover that in another video because that's pretty much a topic all of itself. But brightness, where exposure tends to work in the highlight in the brighter parts of the photo, brightness is kind of like an overall brightening. Okay, so if you need to kind of brighten everything in the photo, you can see here, kind of brightens everything, where exposure is really just pushing a lot of my brighter, my highlight areas in the photo toward white. Brightness kind of works more inside this part of the histogram. Now we'll go down to clarity, vibrance, and saturation. Clarity is brand new, and this is brand new inside of Camera Raw 4.1, so you'll definitely need to make sure you download the latest plugin. Clarity, and I've heard it described as a local contrast enhancement. But if you don't know what a local contrast enhancement is, it doesn't do a whole lot for you. So the way I like to think of it as, it's kind of a mid-tone contrast boost. Okay? Where contrast, the contrast slider, that's kind of like everything. You can see in it, it gets pretty bad on your photo right off the bat here. I don't have to go up quite that high, but I don't really like what contrast does to my photos. The clarity slider is actually a nice addition. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in just so we can see everything a little closer. And watch what the clarity slider does. And it's real subtle, but it's nice. See that? I'm going to kind of just bounce back and forth. This is 0, 100, 0, 100 again. It's subtle, but it's effective. It's hard to explain. And if you look at the histogram, watch how it moves. This is at 0. This is at 100. See how that it kind of just spreads the histogram out a little bit. So that's what they mean by local. It's just mainly geared toward those mid-tone areas, toward the mid-tone gray areas of your photo. And I find it gives a nice, kind of almost a nice sharpening / contrast boost to the photo. And you can see how it works on skin as well as on the texture over here. All right, so it does give a very, very nice little setting over here. The way I use it, you want to be in at least 50%, if not all the way in at 100%. And I'll tend to just look at some of the edges here. And I'll take that clarity up, and sometimes I'll see just a little bit of a halo around some of the edges. And when I see that, I'll pull my clarity back down just a little bit. Okay? So I think it's a nice addition here. Vibrance and saturation. Saturation used to be all we had. Vibrance was added when CS3 was released. Saturation, I'm going to bump this up. Let's take it up to 50 here. And turn my highlight clippings off. And you can see what it does to the photo. It saturates all the colors in the photo. All right? Let's take that back down to 0. Now watch vibrance. I'm going to take this up to 50. And you don't see it too much. You'll see it in the color of her shirt, though. Watch. This is all the way at 0. See how we're boosting a little bit of color into her shirt? Let's zoom in on that area some down here maybe. 0. See the difference? You'll see it hit the skin tone a little bit, but not in too bad of a way. All right? Kind of adds a little bit of a yellow-orange cast to it. But what it's doing is it's working on the undersaturated colors inside your photo. Where saturation is kind of just like full blast, all right? It's working on everything, and it makes her look like she has a bad sunburn. That was vibrance at 50. Again, look at saturation, even at 35. It looks bad already. Bad, bad, bad. All right, so sometimes if you've got a photo with really undersaturated, give saturation a try. If you've got photos of people, though, I think you're going to like vibrance a lot more because it tends to leave those skin tones intact while really just attacking some of the undersaturated colors inside the photo. Okay, folks, so at this point, we've seen the basic tab here. This is where I spend 90% of my time here in Camera Raw. When I'm done, I have two options. I can open the image inside Photoshop if I want to do my retouching or my compositing or any of the pixel level work, all right? Or I can click Done. If I click Done, watch what happens in Bridge here. See how it updates the preview? And see that little icon? That means I've made edits to this RAW file. Camera Raw remembers those edits, so when I double click, it brings me right back to that same dialog box with those same edits. So I don't have to do anything. All my processing changes are done. If I do decide I want to work on it in Photoshop, I can click on Open Image. At this point, I won't be working on the RAW file anymore, though. At this point, I'm working on a Photoshop version of this file. And what's going to happen here, after I do all my retouching and whatnot, if I go to File Save, you're going to see down here I've got to save it in a different format. I won't be able to overwrite my RAW file with maybe doing all my retouching and my pixel editing and my text and my compositing. That's not what RAW is for. RAW is for what you saw us doing earlier. All of your processing work, you go into Photoshop to do anything that is right down to that pixel level, okay? And you can't overwrite that original RAW file. It's always safe. It's always right here. No matter what I do to this Photoshop file, this RAW file is always safe right here, and it always will remember my changes. It's non-destructive. If I double click on it to open it back up, let's go ahead and close this one down. If I double click it to open it back up inside the Camera Raw dialog, you will see that I can come in here and bring my exposure back down. I can push it back up. I can do whatever I want. And the last thing, I can always click this little pop-out menu here. Let's move it into view here. And I can always come down and say reset Camera Raw defaults. And that brings me right back to the point right out of the camera as this photo was shot. Okay, no Camera Raw adjustments applied to it. I'm going to click cancel because I don't want to save those settings. So there you have kind of a basic introduction to Camera Raw. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to be looking at everything in the coming weeks. I'll show you all the new stuff, all the cool stuff that you'll find that you'll use often, but really most of what you saw here, that's 90% of what I and a lot of the pros out there that I know, we get away with doing everything inside that basic tab, and then we move on to some of the other tabs if we need to. But you really learn most of what you'll need in this video here. So hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned here on the site, and we will put up more